Greetings, folks, and welcome to episode 16 of the Reading of a Journey, an attempt and sometimes struggle at being real in this world. Uh, Episode 16, we're going to be reading chapter 18, Making the Move, and also, because they're kind of short chapters, chapter 19, Come On, Honey, Can't We Live in Vietnam? So maybe we'll get right into this. You may hear a little music in the background. That's Tim Weisberg. This is called Night Rider. And it's not such an old album. I think it's about 79 or so. But it's a good one. And chapter 18, Making the Move. Whether or not to pursue this career change was really the first major decision I had to make as a husband and a father. As a single guy, making big life-changing decisions was a much, much easier thing to do, and for the most part, only affected me. Now, I'd made a promise to someone, assuring them that they would be loved and taken care of, along with any little ones we might be blessed with, for the rest of their lives. Married life had been relatively easy up to this point because Carol and I had pretty much been in agreement with whatever we were doing and whatever life decisions we were making. Not so this go-round. My dear Carol came from a little farming community in Minnesota with a population of about 1,000. In 1968, at age 12, her dad was transferred from his job as a property guard for Vice President Hubert Humphrey to a position as a property guard for the newly elected President Richard Nixon. One day she was in rural Minnesota surrounded by corn and cows, and the next she was living in Dade County, Florida during one of our nation's most tumultuous times. With the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, race riots in many major cities, mandatory busing with many schools, an effort not always embraced by all the students being forced to travel away from their neighborhoods, Carol, much like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, found that she was not in Kansas or Minnesota anymore. Unlike the Coca-Cola TV ad that came out a couple years later, where a large, diverse group of smiling people with flowered shirts sang in perfect harmony, all was not apple trees and honeybees and snow-white turtle doves. Although there was Woodstock, and that did produce some pretty cool music. In Minnesota, where my wife grew up, busing meant that you got to ride on a bus to school. At her new home in Florida, it meant that she was the only white kid on an all-black school bus in junior high. For Carol, the times, they really were a-changin'. I feel the need to mention here that our daughter Hannah is married to a great young man who is a wonderful husband and a wonderful father to their son and our beautiful grandson, Caleb. And I must add that we also have a little granddaughter, Kinsley, now, too. It just so happens that our son-in-law is black. We love RJ very much and are incredibly blessed to have him as a member of our family. It wouldn't matter if he were purple. Actually, purple would be a little weird and kind of hard to get used to. But the point is, ethnicity or color isn't an issue for either Carol or me. Having said that, life for Carol as a young girl in a racially charged environment in the 60s, where she was afraid to ride the school bus and always sat right behind the bus driver, was a scary and very difficult time. She never wanted to move from her comfortable home in Minnesota, but never had a choice. Although it didn't occur to me at the time, I now believe that having experienced that unwanted and difficult move as a young girl, Carol found my proposition to leave our comfortable home in Selah all that more of a painful idea. We prayed, we talked, we prayed, we argued, we cried, we prayed some more. We made a list with all the positives and negatives that such a change might have on our family. After weeks of trying to figure things out, and after Carol reluctantly agreed to go along with whatever I ultimately chose to do, I did apply for the position and was offered the job. It probably took about 2 months to both find a buyer for our little house and to locate an affordable home in the Seattle area that wouldn't be too huge of a commute to my new place of employment. During those 2 months, I started working at the new job and had to travel about 150 miles each way over a mountain pass in the winter. I was working 24-hour shifts and only 10 of them a month, so although the drive wasn't always real fun, especially when the pass was covered in snow, it was still possible to do. There were a couple occasions when all the passes were closed and I had to take an alternate route along the Columbia River, which meant traveling over 350 miles just to get to work. Fortunately, that only happened twice before we made the move to our new home. If you've ever heard that real estate in the Seattle area is expensive, that's because it is. And it was in 1990 when we were looking for a house. Not just expensive, but for us, untouchable. It got to the point where we were forced to start looking at some alternative options. One of the last places I ever expected to live again was the wonderful little town of Hansville, the place where my aunt and uncle owned and operated the fishing resort. After they sold the resort, June and Glenn started a construction company and began to build houses in the Hansville area. In our desperation of not being able to find something we could afford that was fairly close to the new job, we gave June and Glenn a call. It just so happened they had a little 3-bedroom house which had been a rental but was now on the market, and they were willing to make us a really great deal. Living in Hansville would mean that in order to get to my new job, I would need to drive about 20 minutes to a ferry, take a 30-minute boat ride across Puget Sound, followed by an additional 30-minute drive to work. Compared to traveling 150 miles from Selah to Monroe, that was a piece of cake. And for me, it was kind of a dream come true because we'd be able to live in beautiful Hansville. I'm pretty sure Linda Ronstadt really would have loved it there in the 70s. For Carol, although she was agreeable to the idea, dream come true might not have been just how she was thinking about the whole thing. As a mom of a 14-month-old, moving to this rural little village on the northernmost tip of the Kitsap Peninsula, where she would be a stranger in a strange land, was a little like moving to another planet. In fact, on the day we visited Hansville and did a tour of what would be our new little castle in paradise, she sat down on the front porch, looked around, and threw up. I could only hope that things would get better. Things definitely did get better, and although it took a while, Carol grew to love our home in Hansville. In the 5 years we lived there, lots of things happened. The birth of our second daughter, Abigail, the birth of our son, Philip, and a new position as a paramedic firefighter in the town of Kingston for a fire department that provided emergency services where we lived. No question about it, I was a very blessed and very fortunate guy. We remained in our little Hansville house for another year or so after starting the new job, and then decided that it might be nice for the kids to each have a bedroom of their own. Although we weren't able to locate anything in Hansville, we did find an affordable house with the extra bedroom we were looking for in a great neighborhood that wasn't too far away. I later came to find out it was 12 and a half miles from home to the fire station when commuting to work by bike. We rented out the Hansville house for a while, but then decided on selling it to a nice young couple who had recently been blessed with a newborn baby boy. Since we were given such a great deal from Aunt June and Uncle Glenn on the house, we thought it seemed only right to pass that on to the new buyers and pay it forward with the agreement that they would do the same if and when they sold. Last I heard, the young couple, who ended up doing very well as owner operators of a local business, built a big, beautiful home and moved out of the little Hansville house. I hope they remembered our agreement and chose to pass on the blessing. Unfortunately, not so very long after making our move to the new house, I found myself dealing with what was a very advanced case of arthritis in the left hip. Arthritis had been diagnosed a couple years earlier, and we knew that something would have to be done someday, but never expected it to be so soon. It progressed really fast. As it turned out, I ended up needing and receiving a hip replacement at only 39 years of age. I was actually the youngest person my surgeon had ever performed a hip replacement on up to that point. Just a week after hip surgery, our whole family had their world shaken when unexpectedly, Mom ended up in the hospital needing an operation for her heart. Our dear mother passed away in the cardiac care unit just a day after the surgery. I think my brothers and I were also stunned and numb from losing Mom, that we were a little hasty when we decided not to have an autopsy done. We all determined that whatever the reason for Mom's death, there was nothing anyone could do about it now, so why even pursue the issue? Although that was true, and knowing why Mom died wasn't going to bring her back, I later determined that it would have been pretty important for the doctors, surgeons, and nurses to know just what may have happened. And truth was, I really did want to know. Regardless of that, Mom has been more missed than I can possibly say. I do so hope heaven turns out to be at least a little something like I think it will, and then I'll actually get to be there. I'm longing to spend time with Mom and Dad again. Also, I love the idea that someday, after they've lived long and fruitful lives here on earth, my kids will have the chance to get to know and spend time with their grandma and grandpa. Being employed by the fire department was without question one of the greatest jobs I've ever been given. Great people, great job, and all kinds of job satisfaction. Happily, the hip healed up fairly quickly, and it wasn't too long before I was back to work. It was actually after getting the new hip that I started making the 12.5-mile bike trip from our home to the fire station as part of my rehabilitation. Fortunately for other riders, the county finally widened the shoulders of the road where I used to travel. Every commute was kind of a crapshoot as to whether a truck with big mirrors was going to take your head off or not. At one point, I decided to get fancy and buy a new special set of pedals for the bike, which you could clip on your new fancy bike shoes that I also purchased. This way, not only did you have the ability to push while pedaling, but also pull up because your feet were securely stuck to the pedals. It was a nice concept and worked out quite well, except for the couple times when it was icy, and I found myself pedaling feverishly but not going anywhere because of the ice. I couldn't free myself from the pedals and was unable to put my feet on the ground. My only option was just to fall over. This happened once in our driveway, which wasn't so bad, but it also happened while riding along a busy road. Admittedly, it was a little embarrassing to fall over sideways with traffic traveling by. Probably within a week of the highway fall, I replaced the very cool and very modern little clip-in pedals with the biggest old-style ones I could find. I then brought the very cool and very modern bike shoes along with the pedals to the Goodwill. Please know that although I did try to step it up a little as a bicycle commuter and give the fancy pedals and shoes a try, I never did feel the need to go with any stretchy bicycle wear. As a wise person once told me, spandex is a privilege, not a right. Something that followed us from eastern Washington to our new location on the west side of the mountains was an ongoing desire to be involved with city missions. The church we were attending had a close connection to a mission in Seattle, as its director and his family went to that same church. They were looking for someone to coordinate a group of folks to go over each month on the ferry and provide a chapel service for the mission guests and then help them and then serve them dinner. Seeing how this was one of the ways Carol and I had participated in Yakima, it seemed like a nice fit and a good way to help out. This time we were able to bring not just baby Hannah, but all three of our kids to the mission with us. It was a chance for them to serve others and also to see firsthand that there were folks out there who weren't nearly as fortunate as them. In addition to a desire to be involved with city missions, I had also often wondered if our family might ever have the opportunity to participate with missions in an international setting. My love for travel and to experience cultures other than my own was still very much alive. Living, serving, and learning in another country was something I thought would be really good for our whole family. If I thought that Carol was unenthused when I suggested that we move from Selah to Western Washington, I would come to learn what unenthused really looked like when I pushed the idea of moving our family to another country. So that concludes making the move, and we'll now be looking at chapter 19, Come On Honey, Can't We Live in Vietnam? So I think we'll get right into that. As mentioned earlier, Carol and I were a little unconventional, to say the least, when we chose to get married after only a 3-day engagement. In the short time we'd been getting to know each other prior to marriage, although we both learned a lot, there was definitely some missing information yet to be discovered. For instance, Carol knew that I'd spent a few years living and working in other countries. From that little bit of info, she deduced and hoped that I was done with that phase of life and would now just want to settle down in the good old US of A. I knew that Carol had also traveled in Europe during her younger years. From that little bit of info, I deduced and hoped that, like me, Carol was such a lover of other cultures, she would naturally want to give herself and our kids the opportunity to grow and learn by living and serving in another country. We were both a little mistaken. At least to some extent, part of what motivated me to pursue becoming a paramedic was the idea that it might be a skill that could be useful and desirable outside of the United States. It just so happened that the Seattle area, where we lived, was home to the headquarters of a few organizations involved with medical and humanitarian missions serving all over the world. One of these organizations in particular was in the process of expanding a program in Vietnam, which provided vocational training for disabled young people whose lives have been impacted by the long-term effects of Agent Orange. The project was headquartered out of Da Nang, Vietnam's third largest city, located on the country's eastern seacoast. After communicating back and forth by email with both the director and manager of the program, I was led to believe that working with this project was not at all out of the question and could in fact actually be a reality for our family. It could have been that Carol didn't think I would pursue the whole idea of moving our home to another country quite as intensely as I did. Or perhaps she didn't think an international aid organization would be quite so interested in having our family serve on their team. Whatever the case, the organization was interested, and here we were, Carol and I, needing to make a decision about whether this was something we were able to seriously pursue or not. Although the two of us had been talking and praying together throughout this process, we hadn't come to a place of agreement about what we thought God had in store for our future. Truth be told, inside, I probably wasn't so much asking for God's will, but rather that His will would be for us to go. And I'm pretty sure that Carol's prayer from the depths of her heart was that God's will would not be for us to go. For me, it was pretty clear. We should be living and working in Vietnam. For Carol, it was also pretty clear. She was very, very happy living and raising our children in the Great Northwest, and at least during this particular season of life, wasn't at all convinced that we should be living and working in Vietnam. What we did agree upon was that a decision this huge needed to be as thoughtful as we could make it, and one that neither of us would regret. As a result, and in order to be as well informed as we could, Carol, Hannah, Abby, Philip, and I found ourselves spending about 3 weeks traveling throughout the land of Vietnam, and also meeting together with the country director of the project, which we'd been considering. What an amazing, amazing experience. It was difficult to imagine that this unbelievable land, so rich in sights and sounds and tastes and smells and wonderfully hospitable people, was the same place I'd spent most of my childhood and teenage years hearing such horrible reports about on the news. The same place that saw a war lasting about 2 decades and that was responsible for the loss of anywhere from 1.3 to perhaps as many as 3.9 million lives, depending on what statistics you look at. This was even harder to imagine when on more than one occasion, the staff at some of the hotels we stayed at would laughingly chase our kids around in order to give them a big hug. We originally flew into Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, and from there visited Cu Chi and the Cu Chi tunnels, the Mekong Delta, Da Nang, Hoi An, Hue, Hanoi, Ha Long Bay, and completed our trip back in Saigon. I'll never forget the beautiful French-influenced city of Hoi An, located just south of Da Nang. While there, we made friends with a couple young people who owned and operated a tailor shop. With a young couple who owned and operated a tailor shop, and who had a little boy about the same age as our youngest. While Carol and I were talking with them about having a few pieces of clothing made, we managed to lose track of Philip, who'd been outside having a pretend sword fight with their son. We couldn't find him because he was upstairs in the house above the shop where his new friend and family lived. Our kids were all keeping journals during the trip, and we later saw that Philip's entry for that day included a drawing of him and his little buddy having a pillow fight while they were upstairs. It was so classic. We were constantly being awed by the wonderful surprises that Vietnam had to show us, whether it be the amazing stalactites and stalagmites inside the cave of a towering rocky island in Ha Long Bay, or a cruise down the perfumed river with a stop at the magnificent ancient capital of Hue, or a visit to a small island while on a boat ride down the Mekong River, where our kids could hike through the jungle, ending up in a little village where we drank tea and enjoyed the sounds of traditional Vietnamese folk music. It was strange, but the music somehow made me think of bluegrass from back home. The lovely young lady doing the singing actually reminded me of Emmylou Harris. While on the island, the kids were excited about getting to meet and hold a very large boa constrictor. Carol, on the other hand, chose to pass on a chance to wear a big friendly snake around her shoulders. During our time in Hanoi, we spent a day with the director of the aid organization I'd been communicating with, along with his wife. We were able to learn some more specifics about the project, as well as a little bit about what it was like to live in Vietnam as an American. We truly did have an unforgettable and magnificent trip, And by its end, we're much better prepared to make a more educated and intelligent decision about living and working in Southeast Asia or not. So that concludes chapter 19. I think we're going to call that a wrap for today. And next go around, we'll be looking at chapter 20. Carol tried to kill me. It's a good one. So thanks again. And for now, all the best and adios.